Good afternoon and welcome to this Heritage Lecture. We have a very distinguished speaker today. Briefly, Professor M.S. Seshadri was the best outgoing student from the University of Madras during his MBBS days. He did his MD Medicine from CMC Vellore and PhD in Endocrinology from the University of Sydney. He served as Professor of Medicine at CMC, started the Department of Endocrinology at CMC Vellore, started the DM program here and has been a PhD guide to many students. The reason we selected this topic of history taking today is because when a patient presents to a doctor with an undiagnosed illness, it is a little bit like coming to a highway roundabout that is not signposted. Sometimes our own professional bias may send the patient down the first exit route of our own specialty. And if we are wrong, we waste a lot of time, money, and sometimes we lose lives before the diagnosis is reconsidered. There were two reasons why I asked Dr. Seshadri to take this talk. As medical students, we were amazed by his magical ability to make a rare diagnosis accurately from a common symptom. But there's a more important reason. Several years after he became a consultant endocrinologist, I took a relative to him who did not have any exotic problem, just some commonplace issues. But it was also beautifully and systematically approached. At the end of it, we had 6 definite diagnoses, 1 differential diagnosis, and a clear plan about how to proceed. If someone of Dr. Seshadri's great knowledge and wealth of clinical experience still depends on the bedrock of clinical history, it is worth revisiting for all of us. So to speak to us on history taking, the cornerstone of clinical diagnosis, I hand over to Professor M.S. Seshadri. Thank you, sir.
Thank you, Rina, for that very nice introduction. Not sure I deserve all that. I was very glad that you asked me to talk about this because this is a subject after my own heart. Can I have the first slide? Many of you would have seen the picture of this doctor in textbooks of medicine, Sir William Osler, 1849 to 1919, man of many talents, a man who was credited with many firsts. One of his most important achievements was to get medical students from their classrooms to the bedside. The other major achievement that he had to his credit was to start one of the most important continuing medical education programs, the Journal Club. Next slide. Sir William Osler used to tell his students, listen to your patient. He is telling you the diagnosis. Truer words could not have been said or said with such authority. He also said, a good physician treats the disease. The great physician treats the patient who has the disease. The implication is very subtle but clear. For you to treat anybody, you need to know the patient in and out. And the only way you can get to know your patient in and out is by talking to him and listening patiently to him. And that is the history. Next slide. Of all the diagnostic tools at the disposal of a physician, there is one that is least expensive, most valuable, but often underutilized, the patient's clinical history. Next slide. When you talk about history, you would have heard in your high school days that it is an orderly documentation of events. It depicts chronological sequence of events that took place. There is a non-judgmental presentation of facts. And true historians present information without any distortion. A good physician does the same with the information he derives from his patients. Next slide. The components of a good clinical history, you have been taught this as undergraduate students, again as postgraduate students, includes presenting complaint, history of presenting complaint, past history, family history. Next slide. Personal habits, occupational history, socio-economic history, and a drug history. And when you are taught all this, undergraduates in particular do not pay much attention to this because there is this most exciting field of going and listening to the patient, listening to a murmur, uh, palpating a mass. There are so many exciting things that are going around them that history taking is relegated to the backbench to a certain extent. Next slide. Every aspect of history taking is important, and that is what I want to illustrate with a few true stories that I have come across over the last 40 odd years. Next slide. Very often, like Rina pointed out, when the patient first visits a doctor, if the right direction is not chosen, you start barking up the wrong tree. Next slide. There's one such example, a 60-year-old male who went to an orthopedic surgeon for bilateral knee pain. He was told he has osteoarthritis of the knees. The patient also mentioned that he does get up 2 to 3 times at night to avoid urine, and so he was referred to a urologist. He underwent an ultrasound scan. He was told he has an enlarged prostate gland. He was advised surgery, and a date was scheduled for the same. Next slide. The patient asked the doctor, will the surgery cure my knee pain? The answer was no, but you do need surgery for the enlarged prostate. The patient asked, I came for knee pain. You are asking me to undergo surgery for the prostate. How will it cure my knee pain? The doctor's answer was very clever. You go into your room, you hear some noise, you explore, you find a thief hiding under the bed. Will you not tackle him? The patient was wise. He changed the doctor immediately. What went wrong here? Next slide. The patient's presenting complaint was not addressed by the treatment suggestor. Please remember, the presenting complaint of the patient is vital. The patient was a known diabetic on irregular treatment. The doctor did not ask him details about his past illness. The increased urinary frequency was due to uncontrolled diabetes. After proper treatment for diabetes, there were no further urinary symptoms. With lifestyle modification and a 5 kg weight loss, the knee pain resolved. Remember, this patient almost had a needless operation. Had he been a little more gullible, he would have landed up having the surgery. The moral of the story is that you need to take a full history. A part of the history is never sufficient, and never act in haste without listening to all that the patient has got to say. Do not forget the presenting complaint. Next slide. Well, this is a common symptom that you encounter when you're sitting in the outpatient department. Disease spells. There are a lot of patients with a lot of disease spells, and they make their doctors dizzy as well. But when a patient comes with a disease spell, a very careful attention to the history can lead to a clear diagnosis and outline a plan of management. Next slide. A 48-year-old businessman from Mumbai, he presented with disease spells for about 6 months. He had consulted a neurologist. There was no obvious abnormality detected. He underwent the usual tests, MRI, MR angio, EEG. He also had an EMG, a nerve conduction velocity, as an added measure. Apart from a lacunar infarct in the brainstem, which was very small, he had no other abnormality detected. He was told he had reduced blood flow to parts of the brain. He was started on aspirin, but his symptoms persisted. So he came all the way from Mumbai for a second opinion. Next slide. When he talked to him, he said during these episodes, he is functioning automatically. He said it's almost like I am out of my own skin and I am watching me do something. He very often was unaware of what he was doing, and the episode used to last for several hours, and he had a loss of memory for what transpired during these episodes. And the symptoms had started after the recent economic recession. His company had made heavy losses, and he took this pretty badly. The diagnosis was a dissociative state, getting fugue episodes. He consulted a psychiatrist. He started on psychotherapy. He is doing well now. The details of the presenting complaint are vital, and if you don't get the details, you will never come to a diagnosis. Next slide. Pain is one of the most common symptoms for which patients approach doctors. Professor Paul Brandt, who was working here, said, pain is God's gift to mankind. But pain is also a special gift to clinicians. A very common symptom, a correct interpretation of which is vital for arriving at a diagnosis. You need to actively and patiently listen to the patient's description of his pain for you to come to a conclusion. Next slide. Well, let's look at a chest pain in a diabetic and a hypertensive. Next slide. 50-year-old male, diabetic for 5 years, hypertensive for 7 years, comes to left-sided chest pain of a day's duration. He is seen in emergency. An ECG shows non-specific T wave changes. Troponin was negative, but anyway, he was advised a coronary angiogram. When he went to see him, he was actually sitting on his bed without a shirt. That was a little odd. When we asked him why he was sitting like that, he said, I just cannot tolerate contact of clothes or of the bed sheet with my skin. I get a stinging pain from back to front. On examination, he had hyperesthesia over the area where he said he had pain. What would you think of? It's certainly not cardiac pain, because the description of his pain is very different from cardiac pain. Next slide. This is what it showed the next day. The next day, he came up with these grouped vesicles along the distribution of an intercostal nerve, herpes zoster. This patient could easily have undergone a needless coronary angiogram. Please remember that when the patient describes his pain, you need to listen very carefully. And if there is something odd that you notice about the patient, please do ask him a question. That often is a clue to a diagnosis. Next slide. Now, the other cause of chest pain in clinical practice arises from the pleura, pleuritic chest pain, but sometimes other issues can be confused for pleuritic pain. Next slide. A 14-year-old lady admitted with chest pain and dyspnea. On clinical examination, she had a left side of pleural effusion. She was found to have a nodule in the neck, and the registrar presents the case as a tuberculous pleural effusion with tuberculous lymphadenitis. A reasonable diagnosis, but during rounds, we found that the girl was sitting up. She was not lying down. We asked the resident, and he says she is sitting up because she is breathless. When you asked the patient why she was sitting up, she said, I just can't lie down because the pain becomes much worse. The only comfortable position for me is sitting up with a pillow in front and leaning forwards. She was sitting almost doubled up. What would you suspect? Next slide. Pain relieved by sitting doubled up usually occurs with pancreatitis. Our amylase was high, the serum calcium was in the normal range, the pleural fluid was hemorrhagic with very high amylase value, and the patient had pancreatitis. What about the neck node? Next slide. The nodule in the neck was in the thyroid region, was moving with deglutition, and it turned out to be a parathyroid adenoma. You can see the excised adenoma by the side. So what the patient had was hyperparathyroidism, hypercalcemia, and pancreatitis. After this surgery for parathyroid, she had been followed up for 40 years and remains very well. She has mild diabetes because she had pancreatitis. So you need to be very, very careful about evaluating a patient's pain. You need to know what leaves pain. Next slide. The other common reason why patients come to clinics is headache. And the most common cause for headache is a migraine. But when you see a patient with a headache, you need to ask yourself, is this just migraine or is there something more to it? Next slide. A 60-year-old lady with diabetes, hypertension, and a past history of migraine headache for more than 30 years came with one severe episode and vomiting, and this is what brought her to hospital. So admitted, evaluated. Her blood pressure remained normal throughout. In fact, antihypertensives had to be withdrawn. The anti-diabetic requirements came down, and it was attributed to her vomiting and poor intake. She was managed as migraine, and once vomiting resolved, she was discharged. Next slide. The patient was not feeling all right and came for a second opinion. On probing, she said, "This was the worst headache I've ever had. I used to have migraine before, but this headache was totally different. My appetite is gone. I have low sugar symptoms. My BP is low. I do not seem to require any of my usual medications anymore." Severe headache, propensity for low sugars on usual anti-diabetic drugs, and low blood pressure reading. These were the clues in the history that led to her diagnosis. She had hypopituitarism, which was confirmed by a low cortisol, low thyroid hormone levels, low TSH. She was postmenopausal and her FSH was quite low. All these features pointed to a hypopituitarism. The clue to the diagnosis was the patient saying, "I am not all right." And you need to probe into that for you to arrive at this diagnosis. When somebody has a headache and hypopituitarism, you think about a hemorrhage into the pituitary adenoma. Next slide. And this is what she had. You see the pituitary gland enlarged, harboring a tumor, and you clearly see a hemorrhage within. After confirmation of diagnosis, she was started on replacement therapy with hydrocortisone and thyroxine, and within a month, she was back to normal. She started requiring her antihypertensive and anti-diabetic drugs again, and she is doing well 10 years after her initial visit, and a repeat imaging now shows only an empty cellar. The pituitary apoplexy had cured the pituitary tumor. Next slide. When patients come with pain, one of the most important questions you need to ask is what relieves pain. Next slide. This happened when I was a registrar doing my MD in general medicine in CMC. A 50-year-old male with headaches for a year and a mild unsteadiness on walking. The headache was severe, holocranial, sometimes with nausea, occasionally with vomiting. No localizing symptoms, not a known hypertensive, but during episodes of headache, he was found to have elevated blood pressure and a low pulse rate, both of which were normal when he was free from headache. Next slide. Neurologic examination showed a very mild imbalance while walking. The fundus showed early papilledema. The rest of the neurological examination was normal, and the details were presented to the admitting neurosurgeon, Professor K.V. Mathai, during rounds. Professor Mathai asked the patient only one question: "Is there anything that relieves your headache?" What the patient did subsequently gave us the diagnosis. Next slide. The patient went into the namaz position, the head down, all fours, and this was the position that gave him relief from headache. This is a very typical symptom, next slide, of a tumor in the third ventricle, which causes intermittent obstruction of the aqueduct of Sylvius. The diagnosis was a colloid cyst of the third ventricle. This image was not obtained at that time. That patient was diagnosed actually with an air ventriculogram. I just put this up because this gives you a clearer appearance of this tumor. Tumor was removed, the patient was well and discharged. Remember, what relieves pain can be a very, very important clue to a brilliant diagnosis. Next slide. Let us come down to earth, from rare to common. You need to get to the root of the patient's pain. It is not enough to just scratch the surface. Next slide. A 40-year-old lady brought by her daughter, a physiotherapist. Her problem was lower abdominal and deep-seated pelvic pain, 7 years duration, a normal regular menstrual cycles without exacerbation of pain during periods. The pain used to last throughout the day and night. The pain was in fact worse at night and her sleep was disturbed. Next slide. We had seen numerous doctors, and during our last visit to a doctor, an ultrasound of the abdomen and a transvaginal ultrasound were performed. A 5 centimeter subserosal uterine fibroid was identified and she was advised a hysterectomy. The lady was sort of relieved that finally some cause had been found for her pain. But anyway, she wanted a second opinion. Next slide. She appeared depressed. She appeared distressed and anxious. It was very obvious that the pain was not due to the fibroid. So we just prescribed a mild anxiolytic and then sent her. She came for a review 2 months later. Her daughter brought her. She was sleeping better, but the pain persisted. 2 visits and the husband hadn't come. So I just asked the patient, how come your husband has not come? She just broke down and started weeping. I asked the daughter to leave the room and interviewed her with the nurse. Next slide. Her husband was addicted to alcohol. She was subjected to verbal and physical abuse. The daughter had grown up and she had left home. The patient was alone in her suffering. She did not want her daughter to be upset and she never shared these details with her. Her pain was really genuine, but certainly not due to the fibroid. No investigation under the sun can lead you to this diagnosis. Only a careful and sympathetic history can. Next slide. We have a de-addiction program in the hospital in which I work. We sent our counselor to talk to the husband. He enrolled in the program. He stayed off alcohol for the last 2 years. In the last follow-up, this lady came up. She was beaming. She invited me to her daughter's wedding. So here, the pain is so removed from what the patient will initially tell you on the first visit. You need to keep probing and you need to keep searching till you come to the correct answer. And if you don't address the root cause, you will never rid this patient of her pain. And this is a scenario that we see repeatedly where we work, where alcoholism is quite rampant. Next slide. One of the important things that you need to pay attention to when you take a history is how, where, and when symptoms started. Next slide. This happened when I was a postgraduate student in CMC. A 34-year-old was brought to the casualty with severe breathing difficulty. He had a tachypnea, he had a tachycardia of 120. He was hypotensive. He had cellulitis of the right leg with redness and local warmth. And tentatively, he was diagnosed to have sepsis and septic shock. He was started on IV fluids and antibiotics after appropriate tests, including a blood culture. But his tachypnea worsened over the next 2 hours. He was admitted to the ICU, intubated, and connected to a ventilator. There was something that did not fit in. Next slide. This is what his leg looked like. Pretty bad. Next slide. We reviewed the history with the wife of the patient who appeared on the scene. He said he was a manual laborer, was completely all right the previous day. There was no injury at the workplace. He woke up around 4 a.m. with pain in the right leg and became breathless within the next 30 minutes. The sequence was too rapid for sepsis syndrome. And she said he was sleeping outdoor on the ground. What would you think of? Next slide. We suspected a snake bite. This is the setting in which snake bites occur in our villages. Person sleeping outside on the ground, wakes up in the morning with pain and soon becomes very ill. His coagulation parameters were grossly deranged. He was started on polyvenin antivenin. He recovered over the next 3 days. But for the details of the setting that the wife told us, we would have completely missed the diagnosis. Next slide. Very important to assess the socio-cultural setting in which the medical problem occurred. If the proper sequence of events had not been elicited in this patient, diagnosis would have been missed and we would have lost this patient. Next slide. Very often when you are sitting in the outpatient, you have patients who come with symptoms suggestive of a psychiatric problem. You need to ask yourself, is this a psychiatric problem at all? Should I refer the patient to the psychiatrist? Have I ruled out all organic causes? If you don't do this, you can miss serious medical illnesses. Next slide. A 32-year-old lady came with a 3-year history of altered behavior. She was told that she had a psychiatric problem. She has had multiple hospital visits. No diagnosis had been arrived at. Next slide. But the husband was somehow not convinced about the diagnosis of a psychiatric illness. He wanted a second opinion and he came all the way. When we went through further details in the history, she had lost appetite, she had lost weight, had recurrent bouts of diarrhea and vomiting for the last year. And even after 1 or 2 bouts of vomiting, she would become very sick and would need hospital admission for IV fluids. We asked her when she was last completely well. Next slide. She said, before my period stopped 6 years ago, I was well. That was rather early for her to, stop having a period. And when we probed a little further, she said 6 years earlier, after her second delivery, she had severe postpartum hemorrhage requiring 10 transfusions. She failed to lactate and menstruate after the last delivery. And these details led to a diagnosis of pituitary deficiency. Pituitary necrosis due to severe PPH. Diagnosis was confirmed, treatment started, patient is well and functional 20 years after the initial diagnosis. We asked this patient, why did you not give all these details to your doctors before? He had a very simple answer. Nobody ever asked, nobody ever listened. Next slide. Past history, sequence of events in the history and the menstrual history were the main clues to the diagnosis of this patient. And the question that was asked, when was she last well, brought out all the answers. You need to know what question to ask. That is very important in taking a clinical history. Next slide. Now, many times patients come and beat around the bush and you're not very clear what exactly the patient wants out of this particular consultation. It is useful to remember this when you have patients who are talking about many things. Next slide. A 28-year-old lady presented with diabetes of 4 years duration. She had initial high blood sugar values of 250 to 300, but never had ketosis. She had had recurrent genital tract fungal infections, had not received insulin so far. On metformin for the initial 1 year, control was poor. They were counseled about diet, exercise, sulfonylurea was added, and glycemic control improved. So no complications of diabetes. You're doing well. She sought a second opinion. Why? When she comes in, she just keeps telling you about the diabetes. But that's not the real reason she came to you. Next slide. When we asked her why she came for this consultation, she said, I'm planning to get married and I was worried. We told her your glycemic control is good. If you want to go ahead and get married and raise a family, it will not be a problem. We can support you through this. Then she came up. She asked, will my child get this problem? When we asked her why she had this doubt, she said, diabetes runs in several generations in our family, and many of my family members had diabetes starting before the age of 30, like me. That was a very important clue. Next slide. This statement gave us the diagnosis. We drew a family tree and found that she was right. The diabetes in their family followed an autosomal dominant pattern of inheritance. This type of diabetes is called maturity onset diabetes of the young, MODY. So we had a fairly clear diagnosis just from the history. Next slide. What difference does this diagnosis make to the patient? This type of diabetes is often managed with oral medications for years on end. They stay in good control. Genetic counseling is important. Each offspring has a 50% chance of getting the problem. This was the question she had on her mind. And if you don't answer this, this consultation would not have been productive for her. Next slide. It is important to figure out why a patient seeks a consultation. This patient was certainly not worried about her diabetes, but she was worried that her children may get it. She wanted to know. In fact, Modi was described after a careful study of families long before the genetic defect was found. Next slide. Sometimes the patient may not be able to give a history and you may have to talk to an immediate family member. This is very, very important to remember. Next slide. A 50-year-old male brought to emergency with double vision. He developed symptoms at his workplace and friends brought him. He had been feeling unsteady for the last 2 days. He had fallen once but had no head injury. He had been vomiting on and off for the last 3 days, started talking irrelevantly from morning and was confused. No fever or headache. When admitted to the emergency, the provisional diagnosis ranged from a transient ischemic attack to a subdural hematoma. Next slide. Next slide, please. On examination, he was afebrile. No, the previous one, yeah. On examination, he was afebrile, vital signs were normal, he was restless, disoriented, garrulous. And all the things that he said could not be substantiated by the friends who brought him. His eye movements were restricted on lateral gaze. He had mild nystagmus. He was ataxic when he tried to walk. There was no neck stiffness. He had an MRI done already in another center, and that was normal. His friends who brought him were not very informative, so we called for a family member. Next slide. His wife appeared on the scene. She appeared very distressed and she kept on saying he brought it upon himself. On further probing, the patient was addicted to alcohol. With the onset of vomiting, alcohol consumption had stopped suddenly. He was given intravenous fluid in the other place where he was seen, and after the IV fluid, he had become worse. Next slide. This prompted the diagnosis of Wernicke's encephalopathy in this patient, alcohol addiction, cessation of alcohol use, symptoms worsening with IV fluid. He was given intravenous thiamine along with IV fluid. He required sedation, recovered fully within 48 hours. If his wife had not come and given us details, this diagnosis would have been completely missed. Alcohol addiction is very common and you need to ask someone close to the patient. Others may not know, or even if they know, they may not divulge. Next slide. Now, this is a very important question in certain situations. It's generally good to know what the patient does for a living, but there are situations where this might actually yield a clinical diagnosis. Next slide. We had this 28-year-old male who was admitted to C ward in CMC hospital who came with severe abdominal pain. He had been symptomatic for 3 months. The pain was poorly localized and colicky and had similar bouts of pain and 2 previous admissions in 2 different hospitals. Had a number of tests, x-rays and scans. No definite diagnosis had been arrived at. Next slide. And look at what one of my meticulous registrars did. He just took a careful history. The patient said he was working in a workshop. He was not satisfied with the answer. He asked him about the nature of his job. They used to melt down car batteries and sell the lead for a living. The diagnosis was immediately evident. Next slide. We needed only a peripheral smear. You can see the RBCs with the telltale basophilic stippling, very typical of lead poisoning. And you find RBCs of different sizes and shapes, some of them small. This is a typical peripheral smear you see in lead poisoning. We had a diagnosis. Next slide. This diagnosis was substantiated by levels of lead in the blood. The urinary delta ALA were elevated, but the diagnosis was achieved basically with the occupational history and with a peripheral smear. If the occupational exposure in this patient had been missed, the diagnosis would also have been missed. And indeed, it was missed in 2 other hospitals to which this patient went. Remember, when you are placed in situations where not able to come to a clear diagnosis, every aspect of history, however small, may be very important. Next slide. Okay, sometimes you have these patients who come with very unusual symptoms, which are not believable. I had this patient who came with butterflies in the stomach. Next slide. A 45-year-old male, main symptom was something is fluttering inside my stomach. The episode used to last 15 to 45 minutes. Had been a hypertensive for 5 years. Suboptimal control on his usual medication. Physical examination was normal except for a blood pressure of 170 by 90. Had no tachycardia. There were no hypertensive changes on fundus examination. We reassured him. We adjusted his medication. And we said, you come once in 3 months for a follow-up. Initially, when he said all this, I really did not pay much attention to this symptom of his, something fluttering inside his stomach. Next slide. Every follow-up visit, he would complain about the same symptom. The BP tended to fluctuate, but was under reasonable control. And I could make out he was slowly getting fed up with me. So one day I asked him, how often do you get this? He said, I get it 2 to 3 times a day. So I told him, you stay in the OPD for a whole day. And when you get the butterflies in the stomach, you come into my room. I need to see you at that time. He came in around 2 p.m. that day. He said, I got it now. Next slide. The pulse rate was 160. Blood pressure was 200 by 120. And the electrocardiogram showed a supraventricular tachycardia. So this is what we are calling butterflies in the stomach. I thought I was actually dealing with a pheochromocytoma. My judgment was biased, maybe because I'm an endocrinologist. But anyway, we did a secondary hypertension workup. VMA was normal, but he had a very low potassium, and the bicarb was high. He had increased levels of potassium in the urine. This constellation of findings led to a diagnosis of hyperaldosteronism. Next slide. A CT scan of the abdomen obtained showed both adrenals enlarged and nodular. There was no discrete adenoma in the adrenal. So he was started on a calcium channel blocker and spironolactone. And he came in beaming after 1 month. His symptom was gone. The blood pressure was under good control. He had been on annual follow-up for the last 30 years and remained well. Now, you just need to believe the patient's symptoms. I didn't in this patient, and I regret the error. Next slide. When patient complains of episodic funny symptoms, please believe them and see them when they have the symptoms. Pursuit of unusual symptoms may lead to an exotic diagnosis. Next slide. There are several situations where you have to ask yourself this question: what did this chap consume to develop this problem? Next slide. A 50-year-old man presented with restlessness for 3 months. He had insomnia. He kept pacing up and down. So he consulted a neurologist. The neurologist finds that he has a tremor and mild rigidity. He was diagnosed with Parkinsonism. And it was explained to him that this is a slowly progressive disorder. The patient got more upset. The symptoms worsened. The drugs that were prescribed for him augmented his confusion. And then he came for a second opinion. Next slide. We had some more details from this patient's history. We asked him, when were you last well? He said, I was all right before I went to US to visit my daughter. He said, after he went to US, initially he suffered from jet lag. The food was too rich. He had epigastric and retrosonal burning. He consulted a gastroenterologist there who did an upper GI endoscopy and found reflux esophagitis. He prescribed some tablets and he continues to take them. And he had been continuing to have the restlessness and insomnia. He returned to India thinking that US does not agree with him, but he continued to take the prescribed drug from US. Next slide. The prescribed drug was metoclopramide. There are known side effects of restless legs, dystonia, tremor. The drug was withdrawn, symptoms resolved over the next 1 month. Please do remember, before you give a diagnosis to a patient, that it is not a drug-induced problem. Drugs can cause symptoms of all known naturally occurring diseases. And a detailed drug history is very valuable, and it is incumbent on the physician to ensure that a drug-related disease is not missed. The treatment is withdrawal of the drug, not addition of new drugs. Next slide. A 60-year-old businessman from Vellore was admitted with severe weakness and bleeding gums. He was found to be anemic. His hemoglobin was 8 grams per deciliter. His WBC and platelet counts were also low. He was suspected to have an aplastic anemia. It's a very serious disease. The bone marrow showed features of marrow hypoplasia. Treatment options that were being considered included transfusions, giving male sex hormones, and if unresponsive, bone marrow transplantation. Next slide. When he went and saw the patient, he had a chronic skin problem. So we asked him about it, and he said he had been taking a Siddha drug for the skin problem for the last 2 years. We got the drug and read the label. It said it has gold salts, copper, and lead. You all know that gold can suppress marrow. The Siddha drug was discontinued, and over the next 6 months, he gradually but definitely recovered fully without any additional treatment. The drug history that you take should be comprehensive and should include all kinds of drugs from all systems of medicine. Please remember, in our country, several systems of medicine are being practiced, and you need to be aware of potential side effects of drugs prescribed by practitioners of other systems of medicine. Next slide. We live in an era where imaging is very advanced. A 1 centimeter lesion anywhere in the body can be picked up. The problem is, are these lesions responsible for the patient's symptoms? Identifying the link between the history and finding the 1 centimeter lesion is the only way to arrive at a diagnosis. If we fail to do this, a lot of patients will get a lot of tests and undergo a lot of unnecessary surgical procedures. You will never arrive at the correct diagnosis. Next slide. Now, I always admired the way pathologists work. They first look at the gross specimen, then they cut it, then they look at it at the low power, and then they take some special areas of interest and look at them under high power. If the sequence is reversed, it can lead to chaos. Imagine you've got a liver with cirrhosis and a tumor, hepatoma. Now, if they don't cut through and find the gross tumor, and if the section is taken from some part of the liver and viewed under the high power, you will never get a diagnosis of hepatocellular carcinoma. All right. So you need to follow the sequence: a gross overview, low power view, and then a high power view. In clinical medicine, the counterparts would be a good clinical history, a bird's eye view of everything. A proper and thorough physical examination, again, should be comprehensive. And after you've got all this done, then zone in and order investigations and imaging. If you don't follow the sequence, this will lead to chaos. Next slide. Well, I've been telling you a lot of stories, and there's always a moral at the end of the story. When you have an unusual clinical presentation and you don't understand what disease the patient has, you need to go back to the bedside and figure out what you have missed in the history. And all the challenging diagnostic puzzles that I have been called upon to handle the last 40 years, I find revisiting the patient's history the most important tool, not additional lab tests or imaging. Next slide. Well, there's a quote from one of my favorite professors, Professor George Cherian, cardiology, CMC Vellore. He used to repeat this very often during his round. The availability of sophisticated diagnostic tests should not obviate the need for a detailed history and a comprehensive physical examination. Now, these words will be etched in the hearts of any student who has gone through Professor Cherian. Now, very profound words and need to be followed in the practice of medicine. Next slide. Well, let me quote something from 31 years before Christian era from Tirukkural, written by Thiruvalluvar. Now, he was famous for his couplets. He says, Noi Nadi, Noi Mudal Nadi, Adu Tanikkum Vai Nadi, Vaipachayal. What does it mean? Means, first you must know what is the disease. Second, you need to know what is the root cause of the disease. Third, you need to know what is the remedy. And fourth, you need to know, will this patient tolerate the remedy you are suggesting? Consider all this before you treat. As said, 31 BCE. Next slide. Well, this is something that you have all heard about. We talked about all the time. A Latin term which really means primarily do no harm. It was attributed to a French physician who was the successor or the man who invented the stethoscope. And it was popularized by Thomas Sydenham of Sydenham's Korea. It is an essential principle of Hippocratic medicine. I just want you to remember, if you want to do no harm, you need a good clinical history. Thank you very much for a patient listening.
Thank you, sir, for a wonderfully illuminating talk. For those stories which are almost like the Aesop's fables, each with a take-home moral and a take-home message in such a memorable way. Thank you for the analogy of the pathologist and for reminding us to listen to the patient, to ask the right questions, to look at the mind, the social, and the drugs, to look for patterns that fit and for patterns that don't fit. It's a very, very valuable insight from a master teacher, and thank you again. We open it to the audience for their questions and comments. One question which you might have been asked before is that how do you make the time or find the time to take a history? It's a question of value, I suppose.
Well, that's a very important question. Well, when you're in a busy outpatient department, you may only be able to get a very gross history, all right? I mean, I illustrated that with some patients. You may only scratch the surface, and it may not be the time also to probe a little more deeper, okay? So you always ask them to come for a follow-up, okay? So if you make a small note in your case sheet that this is an area that you need to probe more, I think that has helped me quite a lot of time. Like that lady who had the deep-seated pelvic pain, and the pain was due to physical and verbal abuse. Now that patient, I noted down that there is something there that I need to probe. And the second, third time she came only with her daughter and the husband was not there. I just asked her that question. I didn't ask her anything else. I asked her, where is your husband? And when she broke down, I knew there is a problem there. So it is not possible sometimes to get all details of the history at one go. So you make a note of things that you may have missed and you get back to that the next time you see the patient.
Thank you, sir. There is a question which I did not fully understand. It says, does the IOT replace history taking for the younger doctors? May I ask the person to just tell us what IoT is? While we are waiting for that, I just noticed an interesting connection, and this is a heritage lecture. You mentioned Professor George Cherian and his quote about the history and the examination. The relative I had spoken about when I first started this presentation, many years later with cardiac problems, she needed to consult a cardiologist. And very carefully, a cardiologist was chosen, and that was Dr. George Cherian, who is now in his 80s. And they told me that he listened, he took all the records and said, let me go through this before the next time I see you. Dr. George Cherian, interestingly, was taught by Dr. Kamala Vaidilingam, who was from Dr. Ida Scudder's second batch of medical students in 1819. So we have Ida Scudder, Kamala Vaidilingam, George Cherian, and M.S. Seshadri, all passing the torch from one to the other.
I can share an incident with Professor George Cherian. Yeah.
Yes, sir. Please do.
Okay. I was a PG student posted in cardiology, MD General Medicine, and Professor Cherian came to the pediatric ward to do his round. There was a child who was admitted with mitral valve disease, mitral stenosis, and incompetent. The child also had difficulty in swallowing. So Professor Cherian came on rounds, and we presented the patient. So he said, why does this patient have difficulty in swallowing? And it is known that left atrial enlargement and mitral valve disease sometimes causes a difficulty in swallowing. And so I blurted that out. Then Professor George Cherian asked for a tongue depressor and a torch and had a look at the child's throat, and the tonsils were studded with pustules. So he said one thing which I still remember. Uncommon manifestations of common diseases are far more common than common manifestations of uncommon diseases. Rather, a little tongue twister, but worth remembering. Okay. So the child had a streptococcal tonsillitis, which I had missed. And this is a rather subtle way in which he pointed it out to me. I'll never forget that.
Thank you, sir. Yes, that is a saying worth remembering in mind. So we get back to our previous question, which was, for the younger generation, does the Internet of Things or artificial intelligence take the place of the history?
Well, in the current context of COVID, I do see patients online, okay? But the current communication systems are such that you can actually see the patient's face. If you were to see the patient in an outpatient setting, the patient will be wearing a mask, please remember. Whereas when you are seeing a patient on the internet, you can see the patient's face. Now, seeing the patient's face and talking to the patient actually gives you a lot of information, okay? I said history taking. History taking is not only asking questions and recording the patient's answers, but looking at the patient's attitude, the status, how welcome he is. So there are a whole lot of things that you imbibe by looking at and interacting with the patient. The reactions to your questions, all those subtle things are important. So history taking is not just, talking to the patient, getting answers to questions, far more than that. You can do it on the internet, yes, but you can't do a physical examination on the internet.
Yes, there is another question about the physical examination. In COVID times, what can we do? I think you have partly touched on that, but it's different in hospital.
Yes,
there is a first...
I would just recommend the person who asked the question to see the video that Professor George Matthew put up. He worked in Jharkhand in a remote area, and he had put up a slide of how they examine patients with a stethoscope. There's a thin plastic sheet that separates the patient from the physician, and they still use the stethoscope to examine the patient. So there are ways by which you can circumvent the problems that are imposed by COVID-19 on physical examination.
Thank you, sir. We have a question from a first-year medical student in Vellore Medical College, Mr. Konik Samuel, which is similar to the previous one. What do we do with patients who come with a Google diagnosis?
Well, yeah, what I tell them is that same thing that I said before. I mean, if you go Google and a symptom, you are going through uncharted territory. You understand? So you'll get hundreds of things that come. Some of them correct, some of them not correct, some authentic, some not authentic. What I tell them is I give them a particular site to look at, which gives authentic information, a site that I trust. So I tell them, okay, this is a site that I use. Okay, so you go and look it up here. Don't look at anything else. Then I think that helps. But there are some chronic people, people with this Googlitis syndrome who can be very demanding on your time. Okay? So you need to be a little careful with that. So you tell them finally, either you believe the physician who is in front of you or Google. All right?
We had 3 pearls of wisdom there, sir. Thank you. Another question, how do you take a history from a patient in coma?
Yeah, I gave you an example of a patient who was giving a history which was full of tales which nobody could believe. The patient with the Wernicke's encephalopathy. You need to get the immediate letter. And the person who will know the patient intimately will be the spouse. I think that's a very, very valuable source of information. You talk to the spouse, you will get a fairly clear picture of what is happening. This is what happened to that patient. Okay. So a patient in coma, you need to talk to, if it is a sudden onset thing, people who were at the site where it happened may be able to give you some information as to whether he had convulsions or whether there was any premonition. But the person from whom we can get other details will be the spouse.
Thank you, sir. We have a number of appreciative comments, but I should mention the one from Dr. James, who was your friend and mentor when they did MD in CMC. So he's up at 3 a.m. in Florida to listen to your talk. Thank you, sir. Thank you very much.
Thank you, James. Long time.
And several of you have asked if the recorded presentation would be available. Yes, it will, but please could you send your email IDs to our email ID, which we will put in the chat box now. Are there any other questions? Yes, there is one more about Dr. Vanitha has asked, is there a prospective evaluation of this traditional method of clinical assessment? And how does that compare with the modern day techniques?
No, can you repeat the question?
Is there a prospective evaluation of the traditional method of empathy, observation, listening? And how does that compare with what is more common now?
Well, that's a very interesting question. Thank you for that question. I'm not very conversant with the current system of medicine. I'm quite old. I'm conversant only with what I have been doing for a very long time. I can tell you one thing. I do not think there can be a substitute for that interaction between the patient and his chosen doctor. There cannot be a substitute because there are many more things that transpire during this interview which you cannot say in words. You can have questionnaires, you can have pro formas which patients fill up. Yes, they are all useful. I'm not saying no. They may be time-saving devices. I also use them. But nothing can replace the time that you actually spend with the patient, talking to him or her. I think that is very important. You can go through all the details, but you need to talk to them. If you don't talk to them, and if you go only through whatever somebody has written or what the patient has filled up, it does not serve the same purpose. For example, patient is sitting up in bed. You need to ask him why he is sitting up in bed, right? If you don't ask the question, you may lose out a very important clue. Now, how do you do that if you are giving the patient a questionnaire? You can't do that.
Yes, sir. There was that question about uh, what do you do about questionnaires? You mentioned that you do use questionnaires sometimes. So how do you use that effectively?
Yeah, I'll tell you. It is a time-saving device. Giving a questionnaire, for instance, for a diabetic, you can prepare a comprehensive questionnaire, ask the patient to fill it up, but you go through it, and when you go through it, there will be some queries you need to still ask and verify with the patient. So to some extent, it cuts down the time that you have to spend on history taking, but does not completely avoid history taking. No. Right? There are some questions to which the patient's answer may be ambiguous. Those are the questions that are more important. Where the answer is ambiguous, there is something that the patient is trying to tell you which you don't understand. So you need to get clarity on those issues.
Dr. Sunil Gokavi has asked that is artificial intelligence going to replace physicians and clinical diagnosis in some years? That is what has been predicted.
Well, I am not too sure whether artificial intelligence will be an emotional, functional thing. I do not know that. Now, what I know of artificial intelligence is that it will have an enormous number of algorithms, and every one of the patient's symptoms, etc., will be fed in, and then it will come with a set of differential diagnoses. But I do not know whether the artificial intelligence will ask a patient who is sitting in bed why he is sitting in bed. Will it do that? I'm not too sure about that. In fact, my professor in Sydney, Professor Solomon Poston, he was very fond of saying, you can replace everything in medicine. You can replace everything in medicine. You can automate, you can do that. But you cannot replace the physician. It's just not possible. He said, because there is something there that transpires during this interaction between patient and doctor, which is ad hoc, which is improvised. It's a bit like somebody playing music, right? Suddenly he improvises a piece of music. Same way a good clinician improvises a question, right? Now, you cannot, I don't see artificial intelligence in the near future doing anything remotely like that.
Thank you, sir. I think that is reassuring. We have Dr. Trevor A.D.
Yes.
who would like to ask you a question. Yes, sir.
Hi, Trevor.
Hi,
Hi.
sir.
How are you? Hi.
You remember me, 1966 batch, started contemporary. Two issues. I trained under about 2,000 hours of training at in the University of Western Australia under very senior professors. And they would say that statistically, it would be around 70% of diagnosis in medicine is made on history and history alone. What do you think of that?
I would probably say 90%, not 70.
I thought you'll go over 70. One more.
I'll tell you why, Trevor. I'll tell you why I'm saying it to 90%. Because I was very, very keen on physical examination of the patient, thorough physical examination of the patient, and I still am. Okay. But when I've been teaching general medicine MD students, I continue to teach them even now. And by the time a candidate has presented a history and I have sorted out some questions I had on my mind with the patient, I am pretty close to a diagnosis, and I am wrong 10% of the time. So I would say a good history 90% of times.
They say 30% on physical examination, 70% on history. So you go up to 90.
Yeah, physical examination is very useful. It's very useful. You can never underrate the value of adequate physical examination. But
And
the same findings, with the same findings, difference in the history makes an enormous difference. You get what
and they
I
say
mean? Sure, you experience that.
investigations about what 2-3%, 5%,
Focus investigation,
10%.
yes. Focus investigation actually are quite helpful. See, at the end of a history and physical examination, you may not have a single diagnosis. You may have a set of differential diagnoses. So you need to use the test judiciously to sort out between these differential diagnoses. Okay, that is the way tests were supposed to be used. But the way tests are used now is the other way around. We are putting the cart before the horse, aren't we? And that's not a good idea.
Yeah. Okay, one little thing. Who said this? The art of medicine is the art of listening. Is it Osler or is it Trevor Aid?
Well,
The art of medicine.
I'll have to go. I'll have to go and look that up. It's a very profound statement. The art of medicine is actually the art of listening. I think it is very true. But I'm not sure who said it.
The patient was interrupted by my student. My student kept on interrupting the patient when she's telling the diagnosis. I said, she's telling you the diagnosis. The art of medicine is the art of listening. You agree with that, sir?
Yes. Yes. The art, see, the thing is, I call it active listening.
Active listening.
I call it active listening because you are fully involved with the patient at that time. And I generally mute my mobile phone because this is a rude intrusion into history taking. So very often people find that my mobile phone is muted because I'm talking to a patient. And the most important thing I feel is that you have to get under the patient's skin. You need to be in his shoes. You need to experience what he is going through. If you do not do that, you are not an empathetic physician.
Yeah.
I remember Dr. Anna Tallinn saying, she gave a very helpful mnemonic. She was professor of psychiatry here. The oblique approach: observe, listen, question. And listening without interruption gives many parts of the jigsaw puzzle, and then we need to ask the questions to fit the rest of the puzzle. In a way, I think what you said was true, sir. As medical students, we were fascinated by physical findings, and now today we are fascinated by investigations. But actually, the most fascinating thing is the history, because it is different in each patient. And if we are able to recapture that sense of fascination with history, both we and our patients would grow, I think. There is a wonderful question in capitals from Kavita, a first-year medical student, who has written in capitals, "How can we become like you, sir?" Dr. Seshadri, could we ask you to unmute, please?
Yeah, I have unmuted.
Yes.
Yeah.
I think we missed a minute or two, so I will repeat the question from the first-year medical student. How can we become more like you, sir?
You can be better than me. I am only halfway across. Okay? You can be better than me. Just learn to place yourself in the patient's shoes and get under the patient's skin. You need to identify yourself with the patient. If you do that, it's a rare gift, but there are people who can do that. And people who do that make really great physicians because they can't miss a thing. See, they are skilled medical people who are able to experience what the patient is experiencing and therefore will arrive at a good diagnosis. Okay? I've seen people like that. And let me tell you, they are truly remarkable. And they don't take as much time as I do. They are able to do that much faster, maybe because of their empathy. That's why I said that is one of the fundamental principles of medicine. You may not be able to do much good. It's all right. But make sure you do no harm.
Amen.
Okay? I think that's an extremely important thing. And the way to achieve that, I think, is to take a very comprehensive history. You must say, if I am this patient, And if I go for the surgery, what will happen to me, right? What are the problems that can happen? So the benefits of going through this procedure, are they worth the risk? If I am in the patient's shoes, will I go through with this? Now, those are basic questions you need to ask yourself before you counsel patients. You cannot counsel patients about something which you yourself will not undertake, right? So you need to be that confident. It is sometimes better to say, okay, let us wait and see. There's no urgency about it. We can wait and see, okay? But never put up something for a patient as a treatment which you yourself will not be willing to undergo. I think that helps a lot in doing no harm.
Thank you, sir, for again putting in very practical terms the basic principles of medical ethics, weigh the benefits over the burdens, see if it is something that you would consider worthwhile, convey it to the patient in a way that he understands and makes a decision in his own context. Dr. Smitesh has written saying that it was a wonderful lecture which he would like to listen to again and again at regular intervals during his learning. And I think we've had so many pearls of wisdom that maybe I might ask you to write a 10 commandments of history taking for us and send it to us, and we would share that with the participants as well. There is a question from Sarkar, who I think echoes the voice of many junior doctors who say that the patients give an absolutely different history to junior doctors as compared to seniors. How do we deal with that?
I fully agree with you. I will not deny that at all, because there are certain aspects of the history which are very sensitive, which the patient may not feel confident enough to confide in a junior doctor. All right. So they may say that to a senior physician, and sometimes they won't say it in front of others. So if you have some difficulty, we just make sure you and the patient are alone, maybe with just a nurse. If it is a sensitive area that you're probing, confidentiality is very important, and you need to be aware of their sensitivities.
I think that brings us almost to a close. I would once again, on behalf of all the participants and CMC, express our deep gratitude to Dr. Seshadri for all that you have given to CMC and to our patients, and for all that you have taught us about how sometimes the small things are really the big things. And we will send you the presentation, and thank you for logging in. Our next CME will be next month. We will be having one more CME with Dr. Seshadri. We will get back to you. Thank you, sir, and have a good weekend.